Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Steve Sweeney. Steve Sweeney is a multimedia journalist, writer, and political activist. He is a member of the National Union of Journalists and the international editor for the Morning Star newspaper, writing on labor and progressive issues with an interest in Turkey, Kurdistan, and the Middle East, along with Latin America and global liberation movements. Steve has traveled extensively in Turkey and Kurdistan, including to observe political trials of journalists and politicians, particularly those from the People's Democratic Party, HDP. He is the co-editor of the Kurdistan Media Project along with Marcel Cartier, and in 2019, he founded the Journalists for Democracy in Turkey and Kurdistan with the award-winning Kurdish artist Zehra Dogan. Steve, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So you have recently spent time in South Kurdistan reporting on the war between the PKK and the Turkish state. Can you tell us a bit about your experience there, your travels there, and give us an overview and update about what's been happening on the ground during the invasion?
Sure. So I've spent quite a lot of time actually in that part of Kurdistan, which for viewers that aren't aware of where South Kurdistan is, that's is Bashur, which is what we would call Iraqi Kurdistan, perhaps in the Western media will know it as Iraqi Kurdistan. So I've probably been on and off there since October last year, and I witnessed not only the Turkey's war on Kurdistan, but the build up to it, which I mean, the genesis of this goes back a very, very long way. But things really intensified around November, December last year when the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the KDP, under Masoud Barzani, really started beating the drums for a war on the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, wanting to drive it out of its bases in the Kandil Mountains. Now, this was something at the time that was met with opposition from all opposition political parties in the Kurdistan region. So that meant the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, PUK, which controls the region I was based in Slimani, but also the Goran movement and some of the smaller parties, including the Kurdistan Communist Party, Iraq. And they held peace to the region. And I was attended a number of demonstrations that were held in Slimani. It's easier to hold them there. In Erbil, which is under the control of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, it's much harder to do so because government critics there are under intense pressure, and you would probably know, but if you're not, there were 6 journalists and activists known as the Badinan journalists who were very recently sentenced to lengthy prison terms. One of them, for example, Showan Shawani, is a government critic, a journalist, and he was jailed amid allegations that he was tortured and had confessions extracted under torture while he was in detention. And this has been widely condemned by human rights organisations, by journalist organisations, but unsurprisingly, perhaps met with silence from governments. Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour MP, Labour Party leader, sorry, did write to Barzani expressing his concern over Showan Shawani and for him to be freed. So it's very hard to mount any kind of opposition to the war because it's met with oppression from the state, which is the Barzani. So this was kind of building up then in December and November, and people, the mothers of Peshmerga forces who'd been killed in Kurdistan, which has a long history of intra-Kurdish war and outside forces invading as well. The mothers of people who had lost their lives were also saying, look, we don't want a war between brothers, and they were doing everything they could to reel back the KDP from what would be a deadly war. Now, as we know, the Turkish state on April the 23rd and 24th launched another operation, its latest operation, Operation Claw Lightning, which started with missile attacks via helicopter, but also this time had troops on the ground. Now, this came after a very costly military defeat at the hands of the PKK. about a month prior to this, to the invasion, where I think something like 13 political prisoners, hostages, were killed in an attack that at the time the PKK forces said that this was what we call a friendly fire incident, that the Turkish military killed their own political hostages and used chemical weapons in doing so. So this was a humiliation for Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, and he's having to save face because he's facing quite a difficult time on the domestic front. The Turkish economy is in free fall, and there's a lot of kind of anger growing around his handling of the economy, and that usually means one thing: that he hits out and starts a military operation either in Rojava in northern Syria, and this time he's targeted the PKK forces in Kurdistan. So we saw this air and ground attack. So missiles were being launched against Kurdish villages. They claim to be targeting PKK, so they've been largely in the Zap and Matina Aveshin Mountains region in Duhok province, which is a mountainous border that shares a border with Turkey. But the results of this have seen something like the Christian Science monitoring group said that something like 1,500 Kurdish villagers have been forced to flee their homes. Now, I've spoken to many of those people that were forced to flee their homes, and they were saying, look, we have nothing, we have nowhere to go. Some of us have family in some of the bigger cities and towns, but others have, we have to stay because we have nowhere to go, and we're just farmers. And they were killing cattle, they were destroying churches. They were a report that I reported on. Thousands of acres of land, forest land and green land has also been destroyed. Now Turkey's doing this again with reportedly thousands of jihadists. These are the same people that Turkey has mobilized in Libya in the fight against Haftar's forces there. The same forces that were mobilized in Nagorno-Karabakh in support of Armenia. The same jihadist forces that they've used in Syria. And that have committed atrocities and war crimes that have been documented. Even by the United Nations has agreed that these groups are committing war crimes. Now these same troops are now in Iraqi Kurdistan, and there is evidence to back this. I mean, again, I've spent my time in the region speaking to people, and they said that they could hear Arabic being spoken amongst the invading forces, which is a sign that that these were jihadists from Syria. And they're carrying out what is generally seen as an ethnic cleansing operation against the Kurdish people. Now, this isn't simply a war against the PKK. We need to kind of destroy this myth, because it's not the PKK that are the targets. It's not the PKK that are the ones that are being forced out of their homes. This is an attack on the Kurdish people as a whole. And we have to say that since that war has been ongoing, it's more than 2 months now. We're coming into the third month of that invasion and occupation. Turkey has sent its foreign minister, has been to visit the area and has boasted about establishing military bases there. Now, this is what, however you view it, legally, this is Iraqi sovereign territory, and they have no right to build military bases there. And the Iraqi government has said that they have no right to build military bases. A number of MPs have been brave enough to speak out about this, but there's something like 70 military outposts across the region now. So this isn't just an invasion. This is an occupation, and this is an illegal act against a sovereign nation. And while this has been going on, the allegations again have been made of chemical attacks, which I reported on for the Morning Star, and I saw evidence of the chemical attacks in the bodies that were dragged out of tunnels used by the guerrilla fighters, and also canisters marked with ammonium nitrate, which in the most recent attack. Now, these are very serious allegations. When we see when we see chemical attacks, or the accusation of chemical attacks, say, for example, in Syria, with very little evidence actually to support or corroborate the facts, and without any investigations, the imperialist powers, Britain, the US, and France have launched military strikes. If you look back at the example of Douma, when the alleged chemical attack that took place there, which again is there's no guarantee that actually happened, or if it did, certainly not in the way that the imperialist forces are making out to be. But it was used as a pretext for attacks. But in the case of the use of chemical weapons against Kurdish people, again, this is being ignored by all of the international bodies that should be commenting or taking action. The United Nations have been silent, NATO's been silent, Britain and the US again have been silent, and it's not like they don't know that this is happening, because they do. But just like in the alleged chemical attacks on Kurds in Syria, we saw in Zehra Dogan the alleged use of white phosphorus, and again in Afrin, we saw in, I think, March 2019, the alleged use of sarin, or a chemical substance there, which I reported on again for the Morning Star. The White House at the time said, well, they probably didn't do it, and just dismissed it. So it seems that there's one rule when chemicals are used against the Kurdish people, and another when they're used against governments where the imperialist powers want regime change. So we're seeing that kind of how war is deeply politicized. But since the war's been ongoing, the Turkish army haven't been met with fierce resistance by the guerrilla fighters, and this is something I think that they probably underestimated. They probably expected that they were going to be able to clear the area very, very quickly, but as we know and has been well documented, a conventional army cannot beat a guerrilla army. It's guerrilla armies rely on the support of the people, which the PKK has, but also there are if you read the seminal work, The War of the Flea, it goes into detail about why this is the case. But the war's not going very well, so they're meeting stubborn resistance. But at the same time this is happening, there's been abject silence from the imperialist powers, from Britain, from the US, from NATO, from the United Nations, and we have to say from the Western press as well. So, but yeah, this is the current situation as we stand. Yeah,
That's great, thank you. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about the issue of chemical weapons that you mentioned. So as you mentioned, there've been allegations or potential usages of chemical weapons across Syria and in different instances in the history of Turkey. In this particular case, during this past invasion, you reported on the use of chemical weapons in a number of different instances, and these claims have since been taken up by the HDP, who have petitioned the Turkish parliament for a formal inquiry. Can you tell us a little bit more about the evidence for these claims, what's known and what isn't, and what the inquiry hopes to establish?
Well, I think the important thing to note is that there has been some evidence. I have the footage, video footage of dead bodies being pulled out of tunnels in Avashin, in the mountainous region in Duhok, that are clearly identifiable as the victims of what appears to be a chemical attack. Now, so we have that as a fairly strong piece of evidence. Dead bodies. I mean, that's a fairly strong piece of evidence. Also, the canisters that are marked with ammonium nitrate that have been used in the attack are again another piece of evidence. There's also anecdotal reports which suggest that the chemical weapons may have been used. Now, of course, these are very serious charges and very serious allegations, and we are in fact talking about a member of NATO, and this is NATO's second largest army, which has probably been supplied most of the weapons that it is using by Britain, by the US, by Germany, and other member states. So, but the fact that these reports do appear to have some credibility warrants an investigation. And the Kurdish forces have been very open and said, yes, we're quite happy for you to come and carry out investigations on the ground to find out whether chemicals have been used. But it seems that nobody wants to take that step. So there's a number of bodies that are allocated with this task. The Organising for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, is one of those, and it was that organisation that has carried out a lot of the investigations in Syria. It carried out the investigation in Douma, and it rolled back. Interestingly, if we look at the white phosphorus attack in Serikania, the OPCW was planning to carry out investigations, but then it suddenly rolled back and it said, well, white phosphorus isn't a chemical, so we're not going to investigate, even though there was very, very strong evidence for that. I mean, from a white, in fact, stronger evidence for that attack than many others in Syria, including, I'm sure viewers will remember the horrific picture of the young boy that was covered in burns, screaming for his father, that was, I think, taken to France for treatment. But that coincided, the announcement from the OPCW coincided with a donation by Turkey to that body of something like 30,000 euros, as I understand it. Now, both organisations, both Turkey and the OPCW, said there was no link between these two issues, that it was just merely happened to be coincidence. And, we can take them at face value for that if they want. But when you see a pattern emerging that Turkey is accused of using chemical weapons, and the global bodies continue to ignore those claims, then suspicions start to be raised. So the HDP, the People's Democratic Party, which is, I always say that they're the only opposition party inside Turkey. I don't count the CHP, the Republican People's Party, as they seem to tail all of Erdogan's wars and whatever, but they have kind of been leading the charge against Erdogan's invasions in Syria and in northern Iraq as well. And they raised in Parliament, based on the Morning Star's report, actually, of the chemical weapons, they called for the establishment of a parliamentary commission of inquiry to look into that. Now, that seems quite a reasonable avenue to pursue, and I would imagine that any democracy would want to be open and transparent, and if they haven't used chemical weapons, of course they would welcome the establishment of such a body, because it would show that they hadn't used them. Now, the fact that this was rejected and described as insulting and vulgar, again, only adds fuel to the accusations that they have used chemical weapons in Iraqi Kurdistan, and they want to cover it up. Now, this is important because we're talking about a NATO ally, a NATO member. This is a United Nations member of the UN, and it seems to be able to continue to act with impunity, and nobody is holding Turkey to account, which makes which again raises suspicions further that, well, if it's not being held to account and it continues to carry out these acts, who is it doing? On whose behalf is Turkey acting? Because we can say what we like about Tayyip Erdogan, but Turkey, I don't believe certainly that Turkey is acting as an independent force, just like Masoud Barzani is not acting as an independent force. Masoud Barzani's power relies on Tayyip Erdogan. He and the West require Masoud Barzani and the KDP to act as their policemen in Kurdistan, to stop any kind of dissent from erupting there, because it would threaten their interests. Just like the Western powers, the imperialist powers and NATO require Tayyip Erdogan to do two things. One is to crush internal dissent, which means that this is why the HDP is threatened with closure, and around 10,000 of its members and elected officials and politicians are in prison with barely a murmur from those that constantly claim that they stand for freedom and democracy and peace around the world. Yet when they come to a progressive force standing up against a brutal dictatorship, they're quite happy to let them rot in prison. And the reason is because HDP, it unlocks the key to democracy in Turkey, and it is the only force standing in the way of Erdogan's wars. So there again, the kind of the victims of this war. This war is not just a war in Iraqi Kurdistan. This is a war against the whole of the Kurdish people, and it's a war against democracy. And it has to really be seen in those terms, as part of a global the global situation. It's not really just boiled down to this one small part of the world. This is a war that's been waged by NATO, by the United Nations, by the US, by Britain, by all of the forces of imperialism that are backing Turkey to the hilt, both politically and militarily. So, like I said, Erdogan is not as powerful as people may think he is, because I can tell you something: if the Western powers want rid of a leader that they don't particularly like, they're very brutal and very good at doing it. So as soon as Erdogan served his purpose, he'll be gone. Make no mistake of that. But yes, I think this is a crucial point. There, the use of chemical weapons is a war crime. And this is really, really important. And there is a very, very strong case for Tayyip Erdogan to be in The Hague, facing charges of war crimes, not just for the use of chemical weapons, by the way. There are many, many other aspects of his war on the Kurdish people that would that would fit the bill. But at the moment, he's backed by Western imperialism, so he'll stay where he is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, as you have mentioned a bit already and alluded to, there is both historically and in this most recent period a very complicated relationship and many tensions between the KDP, the PUK, and the PKK in Iraqi Kurdistan, and the way that the Turkish state figures into all of this with their relations with Barzani and so on. Can you talk a bit about these dynamics in this most recent period during the invasion?
Well, I mean, I think the most important thing to note is that there is mass opposition to to Turkey's war, and I kind of think, well, the KDP are supporting Turkey's war. The KDP, their Peshmerga forces, have launched raids on PKK guerrilla bases, and unfortunately, they've lost some of their soldiers in those attacks. They have been martyred in those incidents, which is a terrible consequence of this. But they've launched attacks that have preceded Turkey's bombing. So they've attacked a PKK guerrilla camp, and then maybe 1 hour later, Turkey starts bombing it. So these are obviously military actions that are joint military actions between the KDP Peshmerga and the Turkish forces. I mean, I would imagine that there are maybe some kind of internal disputes within the KDP, because I don't imagine that this is supported entirely by the whole of the party. I think this is really led by Barzani, and this is the one or two individuals that are the driving force behind this. But then, of course, the dynamics are incredibly complex. So we have the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is the PUK, which operates in Slimani, which is where I was based. They are opponents of the war, but again, they are facing external pressure from the KDP, because the KDP controls the KRG government. And for example, I can't remember which month it was. It must have been soon after the invasion, April, May. There was an anti-war demonstration in Slimani, and the PUK forces. I mean, I arrived, and I've never seen so many people turn up at a peace rally before. I mean, there were. I counted more than 50 vehicles, hundreds of Peshmerga forces, security forces, Asaish, and they were up and down Salim Street, which is the main the main street of Slimani, and they were hunting people down. Now, more than 50 people that were attending that protest ended up in prison for 3 or 4 days. And they were told, I was lucky, I managed to escape arrest. I had my photographs deleted by the Asaish, but I think they assumed that I was just there as a tourist, although they did pull a Russian tourist in amongst the protesters. But they were told very clearly that the PUK forces were apologetic to them whilst they were in custody, and said that they had been ordered to arrest them by Barzani, by the KDP, and they were told if they didn't arrest them, that they would suffer the withholding of money from the KRG government, which again is something that they said they couldn't afford to lose that money, because at the moment public sector salaries aren't being paid, and when they are, they're being cut by 21%. So there's unrest around that at the moment. There's been strike action in hospitals and in schools across the region because people are, are struggling to, to pay to put food on the table, and this is the situation's desperate. I mean, when I was there, we had regular electricity cuts, and and things were pretty grim. So, but there is this this drive against the war, and it doesn't have the support not only of the political parties but the people. The people oppose the war, and my experience was that generally people support the PKK and the guerrilla, and I'm not talking about the people from the movement. I'm talking about ordinary people on the street. And I can remember conversations in cafes where people would sidle up to me and say, we love the guerrilla. The guerrilla fighters are the only people that are standing between us and a massacre by the Kurdish, by the Turkish forces. They're talking about a genocide. The people are really, really clear about that, actually. This happened. A shopkeeper told me, he asked me, I was going up to Kandil, and he asked me, he said to me, if you see the guerrilla, please give them a hug from me, because I love them. I love them. And these are people that many of them are associated with other parties, actually, some supporters of PEK, and even one from KDP. So people are very aware of the role that the PKK are playing and the guerrilla fighters are playing in the mountains, in not only, they don't only speak about them in terms of a defensive force, but as a force that has given them back their Kurdish identity. People were saying that, I owe my identity to the PKK. Now, this doesn't mean that they support necessarily the ideology of the movement, but they certainly don't support attempts to flush them out of the Kandil Mountains or their bases. They see them as inherently part of the Kurdish people. And this is the language that Barzani used, I thought, was very, very dangerous when he was talking about the PKK should go back to their land. And he was talking about going back to Turkey, as though Kurdistan is not their land. And how can you expel Kurdish people from Kurdistan? And it gave me a bit of an insight, really, into how the KDP views Kurdistan and what Kurdistan is to them. And to them, it is only the region that they have control of, and they care very little about Rojava. They care very little about Bashur in Turkey, and they care very little about what's happening in Iran. So, but the dynamics are very complex, and what the danger is as before, is that they don't want to see another intra-Kurdish war. And this was in the mid-90s. There were, the figures vary, but there's around 85,000, I think, is the number of people that were killed when the KDP and PUK the forces fought each other. And in that particular conflict, the KDP played an even more pernicious role by inviting Saddam Hussein's forces into Kurdistan to drive the PUK out. And this is what many people are saying now, is that Tayyip Erdogan is the new Saddam Hussein. And I was very privileged to meet the survivors of the Anfal genocide, in which, for those of you that don't know, the Anfal genocide was a massacre of Kurdish people. 185,000 men, women and children were killed simply for being Kurdish. They were dumped in mass graves across the country as Saddam Hussein's forces launched this assault that went on for years. Many will be familiar with the gas attack on Halabja, and I visited Halabja, and they're still saying, sort of 31, 32 years later, that they still haven't had justice, and they're still continuing that struggle. But they recognised, and I was very honoured to be able to come and speak at the National Memorial for the Anfal in a city called Kalar in the south of the Kurdistan region. It was broadcast on state television, but these are people that many of them were children when they saw their parents massacred and their families massacred in front of them. And I mean, the stories that I heard were absolutely horrific, beyond horrific, and this was a human tragedy beyond anything. But what they said very clearly was, Britain and the imperialist forces either haven't learned the lessons of history or they don't care about the lessons from history, because the Anfal could never have happened without the political and military support of Britain and the US. Britain was supplying arms to Saddam after the Halabja massacre. After this was, this was something that that shocked the world, and Britain carried on trading arms to Saddam Hussein after that. And they said, look, this couldn't have happened without the political and military support of the West. And they're saying that Saddam Hussein is the new Tayyip Erdogan is the new Saddam Hussein, and of course being backed to the hilt politically and militarily by those exact same forces. And they said that he wants to carry out the genocide and continue the genocide that Saddam Hussein started. And they very much again opposed the war. So the survivors of the Anfal opposed the war and supported the right of the PKK to be in the mountains as a legitimate resistance force. And that's how they should be seen, instead of this kind of picture has been painted of them in the propaganda war, which we'll probably talk about in more detail a little bit later. But they've been classified as a terrorist organization, and this is something that I think is poses a big challenge and something that needs to be confronted. As to, this was again a political decision that has been challenged in the court, in the Belgian court, of course, which ruled that actually they're not a terrorist organization. PKK are part of an armed struggle inside Turkey, so they're they can't be classified as a terrorist organization, and that's how people see them. They're seen as a resistance force, and I think that's they have a legitimate right to do so. The biggest terrorist, of course, is the one in Ankara. He's the one that is carrying out a genocide in not just in Iraqi Kurdistan, but he's doing so and at the behest of the imperialist powers. So I think that's the dynamics are very complex, but there is despite the complexity, there is 99% unity against Turkey's invasion, with the exception of the KDP.
Yeah, and yes, I would very much like to come back to the issue of propaganda and the war on terror a bit later, but I wanted to ask you to follow up on this last point. You said that in your view, or from what you've seen, the support in KDP is primarily from the leading Barzani family. And I'm wondering what you think their interest is in collaborating with Turkey.
Well, their interest is maintaining power. That's all their interest is. I mean, their power rests on a lack of democracy inside the Kurdistan region. If there was genuine democracy, and this is what people are calling for. So we saw the protest that I was mentioning earlier that started in. I was involved in them at the beginning, and the first day that we took to the streets. These are teachers, nurses, civil servants. For a peaceful demonstration that was fired upon with tear gas. An MP from Goran movement was knocked unconscious by a gas canister. There was a brutal put down of these demonstrations in the region. I think something like 13 people, I can't remember the exact number, were shot dead, were killed. Children were shot dead, and for simply demanding that they were paid their salary, that they had good investment in infrastructure, that they had job opportunities, that they were able to have a basic standard of living. That was all that they were calling for initially, but then this kind of broadened out into demands for political change. Now, this is what frightens the KDP, because political change would mean that they would have to. There's a broken political system, which means that the region is essentially run by two families, the Barzanis and the Talibanis from the KDP and PUK, and they control every aspect of life in the region. And that means they control the media, they control the government, they control all of the public institutions. So they determine whether you get a job or whether you don't get a job, not just in the public sector, but in the private sector, because nearly every business is owned by either the Talibani or the Barzani or their acolytes. So in order to be able to survive in the region, you have to pledge unity to one of those one of those forces. So it becomes very, very difficult for people to, have freedom of expression. And as we saw during those protests, not only were people being killed, but media organisations that were reporting on the demonstrations were being closed down. Now, I saw the journalists from Ruda, which is Ruda is the Barzani owned media organisation, were booed, and they were chased out of the demonstration with chants of oil station, oil station, oil station, which means that that people knew that they were there to put a spin on events, which they did, and at the time they were trying to blame the protests on the PKK. Now, I was in the region, and I'm very close to people that are supporters of the movement of the PKK in Slimani, and I can tell you 100% they were not there the first day of the demonstration. I wish they were, and they would have been very welcome, but my friends from the movement were not there on the first day of the demonstration. So they were trying to blame the PKK for whipping up hostilities, when in fact they were not doing anything of the sort. And they've maintained, the PKK throughout all of this has maintained a line calling for peace, calling for negotiations and discussions. There's only one force that turned up to those demonstrations ready for war, and it was the same forces that have turned up to a peaceful demonstration with machine guns, and attacked the people. And it's the same people that are now mobilizing thousands of soldiers in the Kandil Mountains, in the Matina and Zap Mountains. They haven't come for a friendly chat. They've come armed for war. So there's that's kind of the driving force behind that. But democracy threatens Barzani's power base, because if you have free and fair elections, they're not going to win. I can guarantee you that as well. They wouldn't be voted in, because everybody knows that that Kurdistan's not a poor region. Just up the road from where I live, there's Kirkuk oil field, which is the second biggest oil field in the world. Kurdistan is a region rich with resources. It has, it's a region of bounty, a region of plenty, but those resources are being stolen by the imperialist forces, but also by Barzani as well, who, as we know, has signed this very shady 50-year oil deal with Turkey, which ships much of the oil out of the region. Who knows where the revenues go? But while the people are living like paupers and are living in poverty, like hand to mouth, he's living in palatial grandeur, and that's not lost on the people. People see this, which is why there's a lot of a lot of anger. So this is why they want to crush internal dissent. This is why there is no kind of, there's no democracy in the Kurdistan region. In Erbil, in particular, is incredibly unsafe for democracy activists. It's incredibly unsafe for journalists. Even, now we're even starting to see some of the human rights organisations and the press freedom organisations, which have not really said too much about the region. Now they're coming out in criticism of the oppression of journalism from the KRG. But they need to keep a lid on that, because once people start finding out the truth of what's happening in the region, then the mask slips, and it's a threat to their power, which is exactly the same reason why Turkey and the imperialist powers want to keep Barzani in power, because if there's democracy in the Kurdistan region, it threatens their interests as well. And the same with Tayyip Erdogan. They need to keep him in power, because a democratic Turkey would threaten their interests in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, and the other countries that Turkey shares a border with. So all of these things are inherently interlinked. So this is not just the people that are crushing democracy in the region isn't just Barzani, but this is the entire forces of imperialism.
Absolutely. Thank you. And to transition slightly, you also spent time in this most recent period in Makmur camp.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences there and how you view the significance of the Makmur refugee camp?
The Makmur refugee camp, for those that don't know where the Makmur refugee camp is, it's situated in one of the contested region, parts of the region. They call it the Article 140
region. So this means it's contested between the Iraqi federal government and the Kurdistan regional government, and there's supposed to be negotiations around where these contested regions lie. So Makmur sits just, I think, just on the edge of what are the Article 14 contested regions. Now, I spent about 2 weeks there, and this is a camp that is home to around 12,000 people. Most of them were fled from Turkey, or from Kurdistan, in southeast Turkey, during the 1990s, when Turkey launched assimilation operations, which saw the burning down of more than 3,000 villages. Thousands and thousands of Kurdish people were massacred during those operations. Again, many buried in mass graves, and a lot of them fled to across the border, and they came into Iraqi Kurdistan. In that time was northern Iraq under the control of Saddam Hussein. So they moved a number of times before they were settled in Makmur, and this is a camp that runs. It's very, very difficult. Life is very difficult for the residents there, and there. During my time there, I saw really the what you call democratic confederalism in action. So this is the philosophy of Abdullah Öcalan and the Kurdish movement, and I saw how it operated in terms of health, education, political education, with women placed at the centre of everything really, and this was a fully functioning society running along those lines, but also at the same time it was subjected to a blockade from the Kurdistan regional government, which I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but this was imposed. It's been in place for 2 years now, and it was a response to the murder of a Turkish intelligence agent in Erbil, which was nothing to do with the people in the camp, by the way. And even if it was anybody inside the camp that carried out that assassination, the blockade of the camp would be illegal and a violation of international law as a collective punishment of the people inside the camp. But it's been subjected to a blockade, which I witnessed, firsthand. It's also regularly attacked by Turkish forces. When I was there, I think drones flew overhead every single night, and the people in the camp, myself included, believed that an attack from the Turkish forces was imminent, because Tayyip Erdogan calls it an incubator of terrorism, because some of the people within the camp, and I would say quite a lot, support the PKK. Now, there's a good reason for them to support the PKK, because in 2014 the camp was overrun by ISIS as ISIS swept across the region, taking control of vast swathes of both Syria and Iraq, causing, as we know, massacres of the Yazidi people not too far away from Makmur, and extrajudicial executions and all sorts of horrors. I mean, they're a death cult. That has inflicted horror upon horror across the world. They took over the camp. The camp residents managed to flee, but the only forces the forces that saved them, that retook control of the camp, were the PKK. And even Barzani recognized the PKK, because he came to the camp and thanked the PKK leaders for their efforts in defeating ISIS. And he called them my brothers, and said that we will work together to defeat Daesh in the region. So when he needed to, he recognized the PKK fighters. So obviously there's a lot of support for the guerrilla fighters in the camp, which again it still remains under threat by ISIS. People seem to think that ISIS have been defeated in the region, but they've just reconfigured into a smaller network of cells, like small guerrilla cells. And I think there was about 80 of them in the mountains surrounding Makmur. So, so I was told by camp officials, and we hear these sporadic attacks, that happen in Kirkuk and other areas as well. So they haven't been flushed out. So the people have their own kind of forces protecting the camp, the self-defense forces. But I was there not long after the last chemical attack, which took place in, I'm going to get my years muddled up, in June 2020. And I went to the site of the alleged chemical attack, and I saw it with my own eyes. You know, it was there, and I remember reporting on it before I'd been out there. I reported on the attack, and I'd seen the video footage of it, which I forwarded to the UNHCR, which is the United Nations human rights body that is supposed to administer the camp. And for 2 weeks, I pestered them to comment on this alleged chemical attack and the embargo. And I was met. There was a spokesman for UNHCR called Firas Al-Khatib, who essentially gave me a really bizarre response, which along the lines of, bear in mind, this was 2 weeks after the attack. I have it here, actually. It said, UNHCR has not received any reports of attacks on Mahmoud camp. Now, this was astonishing. I mean, this wasn't a credible response, because at the time, even the attack had been reported in the global press, not very thoroughly. We reported it, and a number of other organizations reported it, but it was there. But it was also posted on the Turkish military website that they had conducted this attack. I mean, they weren't denying it. They said that they were attacking terrorists, and they believed that there was their legitimate right to launch this attack. So the fact that the UNHCR hadn't received any reports of the attack just didn't stand up. And also, when I was in Mahmoud, I spoke to the camp official who has responsibility for liaison with the UNHCR, and he said, no, we sent them reports, and here they are. He showed me the reports. I couldn't read them because they were in Arabic, but I did later get an English translation of the reports, which detailed exactly what had happened and how many people were killed. He also then said UNHCR is not involved in the management of Mahmoud, which, when I told the residents of the camp, they were really surprised to hear that, because the camp of, I mean, the UNHCR was right in one thing: it hasn't been, it's abandoned the camp after ISIS took over, took a foothold. They fled, and they haven't been back since. That was in 2014, but they still do have they have UNHCR buildings inside the camp, which I saw with my own eyes. It did very little to condemn Turkey's attack, but this is what they said in return. I asked them about what action is the UNHCR taking to ensure the safety of residents, access to medicine, food and education in terms of the KRG imposed blockade. They said the UNHCR is not aware of a KRG imposed blockade aside from the travel restrictions imposed in the context of COVID-19. Now, again, this lacked any credibility, because I then sent them pictures of demonstrations held outside their own offices with huge banners protesting against the blockade. So it's, it doesn't stand up that they they don't know about this. So just recently, again, the camp was attacked again in a missile strike. This is just, I think, a week after President Erdogan had demanded that the UN take action to, what he said, clean up the camp from terrorists. And that's astonishing language to use, because this is the language that you would associate with the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, when they this is the kind of language that they deployed when they were talking about Jewish people that they subjected, of course, to the Holocaust. And he was talking about cleaning up a refugee camp. Now, he said as well, he appealed to the United Nations, and he used these words. He was very clear, and he said, if you don't do it, I will, acting as a United Nations member. So he's very clearly saying, we're a UN member state, and we're asking for you to take action. If you don't do it, I will. And then he launched a missile attack, which killed 3 people. And he's done that under the auspices of the United Nations. So again, there has been not a word from the global forces about this attack. Can you imagine this happening in any other country? An attack on a refugee camp, a missile strike that's killed 3 people? Do Kurdish lives not matter the same as refugees in other parts of the world?
Do they, because Tayyip Erdogan says that they're terrorists, does that mean that they can be attacked and with impunity? I mean, of course not. This is a absolute absurdity. But when again you piece together the jigsaw, you have to say, well, and I've again spoken to friends of mine in the camp last week, and we're in agreement on this, that the imperialist forces, I mean, the global forces, that NATO, the United Nations, Turkey, the United States, are in collusion against the camp. And the camp represents a threat in a number of ways. Barzani is threatened by the camp because it offers a glimpse of how a democratic society can function without the KDP's involvement. And the ideas that are prevalent within the camp, the ideas of democratic confederalism, could, he would suggest, be then imported into the Kurdistan region, and people will see, well, actually, we can do things a different way. It represents a threat to Turkey because Turkey wants to break, and the KDP wants to do the same thing, is to break the link between progressive Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan and Kurds in Rojava. That's what this is about, this creation of what I think in the Article 140 zones that I mentioned earlier, these contested areas, is a Sunni corridor, the creation of this this barrier that will separate progressive Kurds from one another in those organizations. Now, and we know, of course, any kind of, I think Osman Baydemir told me once that, that Erdogan would pursue Kurds to the moon if they were on, if they were on the moon, wherever they are. He sees Kurdish people as a threat. But of course, this unity amongst Kurds presents a threat to Tayyip Erdogan's rule in Turkey. So there's this kind of collusion. These are the most important areas at the moment, I think, are Makmur, Shengar, and Kandil. And these are, the centres of resistance to not only Tayyip Erdogan but to the KDP, and they're very, very important. And it's important that people defend those against attempts at what's happening and against another genocide. But the fact that this is a refugee camp, this is again a war crime. This, attacking refugees. Refugees are protected under international law, under the United Nations, under the Geneva Convention, under a whole raft of pieces of international law. And launching a missile strike on them is illegal. The blockade is illegal. It's a collective punishment. So we have to really, press for these things to be, for the embargo to be lifted. I mean, this is during the time when there's a global pandemic as well. Coronavirus has hit the camp. I was in the hospital there that is there to treat coronavirus patients, and I wrote a report on this again for the Morning Star. But I saw the supplies that they had, and it was, when I say supplies, for the 12,000 people, they had 4 or 5 boxes, no ventilators, 1 or 2 oxygen cylinders. So a serious outbreak in the camp would have been absolutely devastating. And there was very, very difficult in terms of getting supplies into the camp. So they were really worried about an outbreak there, and it did hit the camp. And I think they managed to sort of control it because, again, they have a very dedicated team of health workers there, and a lot of them are working as volunteers in the neighbourhoods. But it's not an ideal situation, and that needs to be lifted instantly, as does the threat of attacks from Turkey, and they need to be held accountable for their actions. But again, we're seeing the global bodies stand by and allow this to happen, which implies to me that they are colluding against the camp.
And I'd like to ask you about this next, the global collusion of imperialist forces to create the situation and perpetuate it.
Yeah.
So about NATO in particular, which Turkey is a member, how do you evaluate the strategy of NATO with respect to Turkey's invasion of South Kurdistan, in particular the United States, Germany, and the UK, the main players, France as well? That is, how do you think that NATO is evaluating Turkey's actions and supporting Turkey's actions in the broader region? And what do you think that this says about NATO's own strategy for the region?
Well, we're just weeks weeks after the recent NATO summit, and if we really want an indication of what NATO really stands for, then that was a great indication, because people often have this, or I think NATO tries to portray itself as a global peacekeeping body, which is absolutely absurd. And we've seen the NATO expansion eastwards, the encirclement of China, the aggressive stance towards Russia. NATO, of course, acts purely, there's no equality within NATO, by the way. It's made up of individual member states, but they don't all have equal weight when it comes to voting or to other rights within that organization. And it has historically played a role as a war machine. And
emerging out of the war against communism, of course. Yeah.
Exactly, that was it.
Mm-hmm.
That was what it was set up to do,
mm-hmm.
and it's carried on that in a much more aggressive manner. And I have to say, under Joe Biden, the new president of the United States, it's adopted an even more aggressive stance than I think it had under Donald Trump, which I think says something, because the people that were looking to Joe Biden for some for hope of bringing some kind of global stability after the chaos of Donald Trump. And let's not beat around the bush. It was chaos under Trump. Trump was incredibly erratic, and his foreign policy was one of aggression and bringing the world to the brink of a huge global conflict on many occasions. But there's no sign of changes under Biden. And we've seen that with his, with recent airstrikes in Iraq and in Syria, and the aggressive stance towards China as part of this, as part of this new Cold War. And of course, the region that we're talking about now was, again, that was, very much part of the old Cold War. But I think NATO is, Turkey is NATO's second largest army, so it's not a small and insignificant force within that. But NATO's politics are driven by the US, and essentially what the US says is carried out by NATO. And we know that the US has, it wants regional hegemony, it wants control of the resources, and of course, if it manages to do that, it gives it another base which it can use to pressure China, and which it can use to pressure Russia. The US is it's in that dangerous kind of state where it's a declining imperialist power. And declining empires are always the ones that seem to be the most aggressive and hit out the most. And the thing that reason that it's driving this war against the Cold War against China at the moment is because it's fearful of the dollar losing its status as the world currency. And if it loses its status as world currency, US finance capital loses its ability to control and dominate world markets. And this is what's driving the current US aggression. Now, I think as we've discussed, NATO isn't really saying anything negative that would lead us to think, well, NATO is unhappy about what Tayyip Erdogan is doing. It's in full support of his actions, and it's in full support in Kurdistan, because in Iraqi Kurdistan, because of the reasons that we've discussed already, but also it wants to make sure that it maintains a dominant influence over the whole of Iraq as well. It wants to make sure that it controls it didn't go to war for no reason in 2003, and for what people may like, whatever people may like to think, it certainly wasn't for the liberation of the Kurdish people. It was a war, it was a war of imperialist plunder for oil, and of course it wants that, it wants the ouster of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So of course it has a vested interest in Turkey's war. It's a bit of a contradiction in a way, because on the one hand it's entered this kind of military alliance with Kurdish forces in Rojava, which when it suits them. But I mean, but it pulls out when it doesn't suit them, leaving again the Kurdish people there to the bloodbath that it's experienced at the hands of the Turkish and forces and jihadist allies there. But the US military, as we know, doesn't act in an altruistic way. It doesn't care about the Kurdish people. It acts in the interest of US finance capital, which the Kurdish forces are well aware of, by the way. Despite what its detractors may say, this is a military alliance, not a political alliance, and there's a very big difference between between the two. But of course, sometimes interests do cross over, and even NATO and the US claims to be wanting to defeat ISIS and Daesh or the jihadist groups again is. I take that with a bit of a pinch of salt, considering that it was the US and the CIA's Operation Timber Sycamore program that was channeling millions in weapons and training to the very jihadist groups that it now claims to be fighting in Syria. So this is part of NATO isn't separate from global imperialism. NATO is one of the instruments of of imperialism, as is the United Nations, as is the European Union, as is the World Bank, as is the IMF. All of these bodies are a part of that system that keeps these imperialists in power and makes sure that these things can happen with impunity, because it's the driving force behind them and protecting its own interests. So so we can't appeal to these powers, I don't think, to improve the situation. We can't appeal to them and say, well, it's not like they don't know these things are happening. They do know, and not only are they supporting it, they're the ones that are backing it, and it's these acts are being carried out in their interest. So, which is why I always say it's up to us to build our own independent organisations that can challenge this, these global powers. And I think that's it. Again, the Kurdish movement is attempting to do just that, as are other anti-imperialist forces across the world. But I think there's a big fight to be had.
Absolutely, the biggest, really. I wanted to follow on from this last point that you made about the necessity for developing alternative institutions that can issue some kind of challenge to these global institutions like NATO. And I'm wondering then if you could elaborate a bit more or share your thoughts on how social movements or political resistance, particularly in the context of, say, a place like the UK, which is an imperial bastion and one of the center points of NATO, how from a position like that one could formulate a political approach to challenge and resist NATO as a global imperialist force.
Well, this is one of the perennial difficulties that have been faced by the anti-imperialist movement for decades, and is the biggest challenge that we have to overcome, because I mean, there've been attempts to build, and I think this is the key to it, is international solidarity, and we can't continue working in silos where people see their national liberation struggle or their independence struggle or their fight against capitalism or imperialism as something that's separate. They are all at some level intertwined with one another. So and it's the hardest, it's been the most difficult thing, I think, has been to get that kind of unity amongst those forces and amongst in that struggle. In Britain, I think people will lament the state of the trade union movement in the country at the moment, from its peak of about 12-13 million to around 6.5 million members today. But we also should remember it's an incredibly powerful force. And if you look at the history of our movement, it was the trade union movement allied with social movements, allied with national liberation movements, that brought down apartheid South Africa, for example. And this was something that was very powerful, because we realised as a movement of workers that we are the ones that have power. Power in society doesn't lie with these major institutions, as much as they might like to think that it does. They can't function without without working class people
tacitly or supporting them or remaining dormant. When when we unite, when we take action, we're an absolutely unstoppable force. Now, I think that in terms of what's happening in Kurdistan, I think for me there are two key elements to this. Obviously, one of them is supporting those forces that supporting the resistance and recognizing their democratic right to resist, and that means supporting the people that are at the forefront of that fight at the moment, and that's the PKK. Now, we spoke earlier about their designation as a terrorist organization, which was again a political decision that was kind of, again, during the war on terror. I think there was probably a trade-off that the PKK would be designated a terrorist organization as long as Turkey allowed US forces to use the Incirlik air base, where it has nuclear weapons, by the way. This is another point that many people don't realize, that there are nuclear weapons in Turkey. This is again used as something to delegitimize resistance, and we've seen this with struggles across the world. We saw it very recently when Israel was attacking Gaza, and there was this but Hamas are a terrorist organization, and this was an excuse used not to support the resistance. And we're seeing the same now with PKK. We see two things actually with PKK. We see one group saying, well, they're a terrorist organization, so we can't possibly support them. But then another group say, well, they're in hock with US imperialists, and we can't support them. So you get that from some of the leftists. And as with everything, the situation is not as straightforward actually as they like to portray it. And it's partly stems from a lack of understanding of what is an incredibly complex region, and it's not up to us to determine the forms of resistance. So I think there has to be this kind of it's not gonna, they should be delisted as a terrorist organization, and the Belgian court case is a good benchmark on how that can happen. The other two things, actually, I said two things, but there's three, but they're kind of interlinked. So the other is one that we've probably discussed before many times, but it's the imprisonment of the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan. And people that don't know, he's been in prison on Imrali Island, in the Sea of Marmara in Turkey. He was the only prisoner there for many years, held in solitary confinement. And but his freedom really is the key to unlocking democracy and solving the Kurdish question. Now, the Turkish state don't want to solve the Kurdish question. That's very clear. The conditions he's been held in have been described by many human rights organisations and the Committee for the Prevention of Torture as exactly that, torture. He's been held in isolation, denied visits from family, denied access to his lawyers, and held in a tiny room, without the basic rights that are allocated to any other prisoner. So at the moment there are hunger strikes of Kurdish political prisoners, mainly Kurdish political prisoners in Turkish jails. I think they're on the 145th day of action. It'll be longer by the time this goes out. And they're demanding, again, two things. One, that they're not even demanding freedom for Abdullah Öcalan. Actually, they're just demanding that he is allowed his basic rights as a prisoner, and they're asking for a peaceful resolution to the Kurdish question. So this is another another campaign that should be taken up in the British trade union movement, which I know has some support in, but that needs to be kind of, I think, broaden out, in the same way that that the organisation's trade union branches launched a mass campaign for the freedom of Nelson Mandela, which, as we know, spent
more, decades behind bars, very similar circumstances. The South African Communist Party and the COSATU, the trade union confederation in South Africa, recognised the similarities between Mandela and Öcalan. So they launched earlier this year, I believe, I can't remember the exact date it was now, but they organised a campaign for his freedom with an open letter to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, which organisations can still sign, I believe, and can be probably found on the Freedom for Öcalan website, which is the British trade union-led campaign. So that's one aspect. The thing that I always press is the People's Democratic Party, the HDP. Now, the HDP is Turkey's only political opposition, or the only opposition in the Grand Assembly, and it is under a very, very serious threat at the moment. Just a few weeks ago, the Constitutional Court now accepted a case file calling for it to be closed down. Now, this is, historically, Kurdish parties, over 70, 80 years have faced this. We've been through it many, many times before with HADEP and other organisations that were shut down. But HDP was something slightly different, I would think, in that it broke through the 10% barrier threshold to get MPs elected into Parliament. But it brought together many of the disparate groups inside Turkey. So it brought together communists, socialists, trade unionists, environmentalists, the LGBT movement, but it brought those together with the Kurdish movement, and in a way that hadn't really happened before, and it represented a real step forward for democracy in Turkey. Now, since its inception, it's come under intense pressure from the Turkish state. 20,000 of its members have been detained since 2016, I believe. 10,000 are still in prison, more than 200 elected officials, 7 MPs. In December, one of the leading figures from the party, the former HDP MP Leyla Güven, was jailed for more than 23 years for the crime of being a Kurdish woman who stood up to Erdogan and was involved in lawful democratic politics inside Turkey. So I say to people in Britain, this is the equivalent of Boris Johnson deciding to lock up the leaders of the Labour Party, throw them in Belmarsh prison, and round up the whole of Momentum, and jail them and hold them there without bringing them to trial. But the threats are very, very serious, and the HDP represents a very big threat to Tayyip Erdogan, and he recognises this because it's the only force that is standing in the way of Tayyip Erdogan's wars. It's the only force that is standing up against femicide and in favour of the Istanbul Convention. It's the only force that is standing up for trade union rights and for workers in Turkey. It's the only force that is standing up for LGBT rights in what is an incredibly homophobic society, which is homophobia is being driven by the government. It has to be said, and is the only force really that is capable of unlocking democracy in the country, which makes it a very very serious threat. But it also makes it underlines why it's so important for us to stand in solidarity with HDP. Now, there's a whole host of things that people can do, but the Labour Party in Britain really has to step up to the plate on this, and it hasn't done. It's been, as you said in the introduction, I've been to many trials of HDP MPs and other officials, and there's been no presence from the Labour Party. There's been no statements from the Labour Party. I've had to prize them out of the party before, in terms of the attempt to shut down HDP. So there's a lot more that we can do. But I mean, we have to look on. We have to look at the positives. I mean, there's huge hope, because we're seeing resistance forces inside Turkey, despite the oppression, despite the jailings and the arrests of whole layers of society, from public sector workers to people in my profession, journalists. It's the biggest jailer of journalists anywhere in the world, with 1/3 of the global total. But that resistance has continued. So it's up to us really to stand in solidarity with those resistance forces, to campaign for the freedom of Abdullah Öcalan, to campaign for the freedom and in solidarity with HDP, and for the delisting of the PKK.
I think they're the kind of that's the three-pronged approach. The other things that we need to do as well, I think, is to take this into the anti-war movement, because we saw 200,000 people out on the streets very recently. I was really pleased to see this. I wasn't here. I was in Beirut, but we saw in the streets of London thronging with people with Palestinian flags, and in support of the Palestinian people, which was I know because I was in Palestinian camps at the time, and they said that this gave them real hope, and they were really pleased to see that their voice was being taken to the streets of London, and of course it has an impact, because we need that mass body of people on the streets, because we know that governments won't act without it. We can't just appeal to the better nature and in the corridors of power. We have to build a mass movement on the streets, which is something we don't have at the moment, but we need to mainstream the Kurdish struggle in the same way that the Palestinian struggle has been mobilized and mainstreamed, in the same way that support for Venezuela and Cuba has been has manifested itself. So we need the same kind of movement for the Kurdish people, if we want to shift things. Alongside that, and I think we might talk about this in a bit later, but we also need propaganda is a very important part of any kind of struggle, and at the moment this is something again that I think we're fighting a war against this at the moment, particularly not just in the region but outside the region as well. In Kurdistan, we are fighting against the Barzani-owned media in Kurdistan, which has been churning out during both the public sector strikes and the anti-government protests in November and December, but also in terms of beating the drum for war. They've been playing a very pernicious role in doing that as well, and those organizations that have been brave enough to speak out, unfortunately, have had journalists arrested and have been closed down. But we also face another fight on in Britain as well, because again the mainstream media, and I'm almost loath to use that term, it's a bit cliche, but organization like the Guardian, the Times, the Telegraph, the Independent, the BBC, all of these media organizations should be reporting on what's happening. This is a major global event involving a NATO power that's committing war crimes with jihadists. That ticks all of their kind of boxes, really, of things that they like, but they're not doing so. Now, there's a reason I think they're not doing so, and that is, again, comes down to media ownership. And for the Guardian and other newspapers that receive millions of pounds in advertising from Turkish Airlines, for example, in the Turkish state, and for people that don't think that advertising revenue drives editorial content, then you need to have a serious think about that. But they have an interest in not reporting on this. But also we have the role played, the duplicitous role played by the UK's embassy in Erbil and the all-party parliamentary group for Kurdistan. Now, if you followed their social media accounts or listened to the issues that they raise in Parliament, you would have no idea that there's a war going on. You would have no idea that that while people were being shot dead, for example, people were being shot dead in the street. The day a 13-year-old child was shot through the neck and killed, the members of the all-party parliamentary group for Kurdistan were holding up pictures of themselves with pomegranates from Halabja, and they were saying, we need to diversify. Look at this beautiful fruit. So they're not just playing it's not, they're playing a very dangerous role, because they're actually playing a role that diverts attention away from the reality on the ground, and they're painting a picture that isn't truthful. And when you see that the all-party parliamentary group, I showed this actually to the survivors of the Anfal, and they were horrified, as were people in Slimani when I showed them. The all-party parliamentary group for Kurdistan, the secretarial support for that group is paid for £60,000 a year by Keystone Oil, by an oil company. and that oil company surprisingly is linked to Barzani. So unfortunately, the APPG for Kurdistan acts as Barzani's mouthpiece in parliament. If you look at the recent motions they've laid down, I mean, they're ridiculous. You know, they're talking about I think sheep being killed or something. One of them, you know, was on about, without mentioning the fact that animals are being slaughtered because of the Turkish invasion, and that forestry in Greenland and acres have been destroyed, and that chemical weapons are falling, etc., etc. And it's the same for the UK. UK and Erbil. The ambassador there, he's just left now, James Thornton. I wrote an article calling him, I think, a colonialist, but you know, after he launched an attack on the PKK last year. But I mean, I stand by that 100%. I think the embassy there does treat treat Kurdistan as a colonial outpost. And you know, again, it mentions nothing about the war. It posts photographs like holiday snaps, people, pictures of him in the full Kurdish dress at various sites around the region. And the sites are beautiful, don't get me wrong, I've been to many of them myself, but the beautiful sites are also being destroyed, and that's something that's being glossed over. So we're also fighting against that as well. So we have a big task on our hands, and we have a major battle, the propaganda war, as well as the war for peace, I think, as they call it, which that's the overriding message that has to be put across as well, is that while Turkey is waging war, the PKK is asking for peace, and that's very, very important, and it's made every single effort possible to bring that about. And it's insists that it doesn't want war, it wants peace. And others are heeding the call, but we hope that the KDP does, we hope that NATO does, and we hope that the imperialist powers do.
Absolutely. And this issue of the propaganda war that you mentioned was the last point that I wanted to ask you about. And we've seen this role being played, as you mentioned, by media outlets in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, by the Turkish state, as well as in the global media. And the war on terror, as you've been discussing, plays a very central role here in sort of banning discussion or delegitimizing at every turn any challenge to international system of state and capital and their maintenance of the monopoly on legitimate violence. So can you share about your perspective about this in terms of the role and impact you think that media and propaganda warfare is having on the situation on the ground? Like how you view this role, you said, as the propaganda war is another front in this battle, as well as how you view your work as a journalist in this context.
Well, I mean, just to start with my role as a journalist, there's kind of this myth that journalism is impartial, and journalism is never impartial. Even those that say they're impartial are taking a side. There's no such thing as impartial journalism. My journalism is objective, absolutely, and that's a different thing. But it's always on the side of the oppressed. So I see my role in all of my writing, whether I'm writing about Kurdistan, whether I'm writing about Latin America or other parts of the world, as this. It's a bit of a cliche, but telling truth to power, giving a voice to the voiceless, standing on the side of the oppressed people. And while it might be a cliche, as a journalist that has these kind of very noble values, it's not something that you see in large parts of the Western press, and they tend to report things. Now, journalism has changed quite a lot. Even recently now, but what you see quite often is that the mainstream media and the major news organisations essentially become the mouthpieces of the various departments of state, the various departments of government, that they just really regurgitate. They get their news from press releases from the Ministry of Defence or from, you know, from government speeches. So they'll give voices to those that are already very powerful, and they'll amplify those voices rather than actually those people on the ground. Now, one of my journalistic heroes is still is Robert Fisk, who unfortunately died last year. And what he said was, you know, he says, you know, some, you know, very important things, I think, that about journalism. But the most important thing is, he says, you know, you can't, you know, as journalists, our job is to report the truth, and you can't get to the truth if you're sitting in an office in London. You can't get to the truth if you're not on the ground, going out and meeting people and speaking to them. And then you can tell the truth as you see it, and as reality is on the ground. And this is something that's missing. And the main thing that's missing is the people that are the most affected by Turkey's wars. Now, this was why when I went to Kurdistan, I went to those places. I went to the places that have been bombed. I met the victims of Turkish drone strikes. I met with farmers who have been driven out of their homes, because these are the people that can tell me what's happening, and then I can see it and I can hear it with my own ears and my own eyes. Now, I think this is absolutely essential, and I would always report on things as I see them. So we do face a huge battle, because I write for the Morning Star, I write for a number of other organisations as well, but in the sort of the media pool, we're a very small pebble, and our ripples sometimes are big, and sometimes are not so big. So so it does have an impact, because whatever we think of the BBC, what it says matters, and it's the state broadcaster, and people trust it to tell the truth. Now, I don't. I take an entirely different view, because I know the history of the BBC, and we can look back, for example, in the miners' strike, where it swapped the footage around to show miners attacking police when it was police attacking miners, and they very famously, but 30 years later, they issued an apology and said, yes, we did it, and we're sorry, but the damage is done 30 years later. And they're very careful about what stories they choose to run and what they don't choose to run. These again are political decisions. So by choosing not to cover what's happening in Kurdistan, and I'm talking about Syria as well, I'm talking about in Iraq, I'm talking about in the southeast of Turkey, where war crimes are being committed by a NATO member state. It's taking a political decision not to cover that, the same for the same reason The Guardian is, and all of these other organizations. So we do need to strengthen ourselves in the propaganda war. Every kind of movement in history, every whether it national liberation movement, has recognized the importance of propaganda and of and of media. So these are the two big things that are missing for me actually at the moment, are, as we spoke earlier, the mass movement that we need to build in terms of mass street mobilizations and a mass movement in working class organizations, but also we need a more effective propaganda organization, which is partly why me and Marcel were founding the Kurdistan Media Project, was to try and shift that balance a little bit. We have some organizations. I work as a journalist. I work very closely with ANFE, which reports on the Kurdish movement. I work very closely, in fact, every day, in contact with the Mesopotamia Agency in mainly their offices in Ankara, and I work very, very closely with them, and we do some really important collaborative work, which this is essential, again, because if we can't get to every single part of Kurdistan, we can't be in more than one place at a time. So that collaborative work is absolutely vital, absolutely essential. And the three of us working together, I think, has produced some pretty good results in terms of, for example, it was the anniversary of the torture of, I think, around 50
Kurdish civilians that were hauled into prison. They were electrocuted. Now, my reporting on that came via, we spoke to some of the people there via the Mesopotamia Agency, and that was picked up by a Labour MP who then raised it in Parliament. And I get regular phone calls from Labour MPs actually asking me, for example, about, can you give me some details and information about Turkey's links with ISIS? So it's, the work that we do is important. So it's important that we carry on doing that. But in order, people often think, well, we need to get into the Guardian, we need to get into the BBC, and as a strategy, I have my reservations about that, because I think, it's not that these organisations don't know; they do know, but they're making a conscious decision, not to report it. But also, with the Guardian, some liberal might read the Guardian and think, oh, poor Kurds, and then put it down and not take any action, which is why I always value the role of the Morning Star, because whilst our circulation is obviously not as big as the Guardian, our newspaper is read by 6.5 million people in the trade union movement. And when we write stuff, and we can write it in an agitational way, it calls those people to action. And these are the people that are in the constituency Labour parties, the Green Party, the SNP, or play leading roles in their trade union movement. So these are the most active layers of society, and these are the people that we need to appeal to, actually. And because these are the building blocks of the resistance. And that's we need to be very, very and use our resources wisely, and think about how we can best build a movement. So at the moment, I think that's kind of something that we're hoping to progress a little bit further, but it's getting there. We've seen the signs there. I mean, I get invited to speak at quite a large number of trade union branch meetings, and once people know and they hear what happens, then they're kind of pressed into doing something about it. And that's kind of what we need to do. So we have to have hope, and I think hope is there. It lies in our organizations, but the two are essentially intertwined. The mass movement and the propaganda, I think, are both essential components of the resistance.
Absolutely, full agreement. I think with that, unfortunately, we have run out of time. But Steve, thank you so much for speaking with us. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with in closing?
No, I mean, I think that's it. I would just like to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you, and for all of those that are listening and listen to this and want to get involved in any kind of activism or support for the Kurdish community. I would say get involved with Peace in Kurdistan. We can, maybe the link to the website might be posted alongside this interview. If you want to find out what's happening in terms of Turkey's wars in Kurdistan and more generally, read the Morning Star, but also as well support other organisations. I would say ANAFE and Mesopotamia Agency, who are particularly Mesopotamia Agency, are under intense pressure from the Turkish state, and their journalists are the bravest people that I know. They continue to put themselves on the front line of the struggle, to a great risk, to report on what's happening there. So you can read their reports on their websites. Get regularly closed down, but if you go on Google, every kind of smartphone or computer or laptop or tablet has a translation app now, so you can run they have an English language section as well, but you can read the stuff that they write in Kurdish and Turkish as well through a translation app, as I do regularly. But that will again keep you up to date with all the breaking news. But and get involved with the Freedom for Öcalan campaign, get involved with a campaign to support the HDP as well. But I think that's probably it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking with us again, and thank you for all of the work that you do and all of the work you have done in covering these issues, and from a global perspective. It's so important.
Likewise. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.